Hello, and welcome to the Classicist podcast. I'm your host, Troy Sinek, here with Victor Davis Hanson, the Martin and Ilya Anderson Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And Victor, we turn today to a topic that's sort of a personal one for you. As many of our listeners know, you spent a big chunk of your life in higher education, primarily at Fresno State, but a number of other campuses as well. And you recently wrote a piece for National Review entitled, "Can Higher Education Be Saved?" wherein you point to a number of ills that are besetting the academy these days. And I'll just have you walk them through us one by one. You note earlier in this piece, I'm quoting you here, "Few believe anymore that current liberal arts programs have prepared graduates to write persuasively and elegantly, to read critically and to think inductively, while drawing on a wide body of literary, linguistic, historical, artistic, and philosophical knowledge." Your next sentence after that one, "In fairness, that's no longer the aim of higher education." So, Victor, what is the aim these days, and is it a worthy one?
Well, it's not worthy. The aim is that from 4 to 6 years, the nation's youth would go to a particular college, and they would get an alternate view of America and politics. And the rationale would be that your family, your parents, your community, your church are hopelessly retrograde. But on matters of gender, race, class, American history, we only have you for 4 to 6 years. So we're going to give you a different version, and it's going to be monolithic, but it's not going to be balanced because, you see, we have to balance all of these other forces in society, and therefore that doesn't give us time to have both sides while you're at college. So it's not didactic in the sense of inductive thinking. You know, we're going to get a body of knowledge and teach you how to look at the world empirically. We're going to give you only a few selected elements of knowledge, and then you're going to be deductive. You're going to start with a preconceived idea, and then you're going to use these to prove your preconceived idea. And that's pretty much what education is. That's the ideological component, but it's also a mercenary situation where we have $1.5 trillion in student debt, and we have these huge endowments, you know, 1 billion, 2 billion, all the way up to 20, 30 billion in some cases, where some of these campuses look like Club Med. They've got rock climbing walls, they've got Tony apartments, they've got therapists, they have everything. And they have diversity czars, assistant to the assistant to the assistant to the dean for inclusion. They've got enormous overhead, and it's all predicated on the idea that the federal government's going to back student loans, and therefore you can jack the rate of inflation. You can jack the rate of tuition higher than the rate of inflation. And it's sort of, these students are now graduating after 6 years, 50% of them are at least, and they're in a sort of a stage of prolonged adolescence. They're not getting married, they're not buying houses, they're crippled by debt, and it's starting to affect the United States with a kind of a catastrophic demographic dip. We've gone from 2.1 down to about 1.8 replacement family size, children-wise, and then we've got this huge debt, as I mentioned, and then we have these kids that are very ideological and almost arrogant, but they're hopelessly ignorant. And I think that's one reason the universities really resist an exit exam. That for some reason they think an entrance exam is fine, and they can be the adjudicators of high school educations and say, well, if you do this many points on the SAT, we'll let you in, and this will affect whether you learn something in high school or not. But if anybody turned around and said to them, well, after 4 or 6 years, we're going to test you with an exit SAT exam to see if you learned anything in college to get a BA, sort of like a bar exam or something. And they've always fought that.
You have some very strong words in this piece about the current state of academic scholarship and the kind of research work that faculty members engage in. And you also see the dynamics there having changed dramatically with the advent of the internet. Explain this critique for us.
Well, the idea of faculty research was twofold. One, if people every 7 years got a semester off, or if they got travel money or they got private money, to do research, then the country benefited in two ways. One, when they went back into the classroom, they had more expertise, more data. They were more knowledgeable themselves. It was an ongoing process of keeping up on quote unquote in their field. And then second, they put a little toothpick on a huge mobile of logs of what we call wisdom. And so whether in my field, if you were studying the use of the subjunctive in Aristotle, and you wrote a whole book on it, and there's books on that, and then when somebody was writing Aristotle's, an introduction to Aristotle, you could use that and say, wow, this is how Aristotle said may or should or could in this sentence. So we allow that esoteric knowledge. The problem now is that there's so much money invested into the scholarship, and the teaching loads have been drastically reduced, and the use of part-time help-like instructors has increased. And yet, when we look at the research, it's so esoteric and it's so specialized that it's absolutely of no value to not just people within the field, but everybody outside the field. And then it's politicized. It tends to want to show a pathology about American life, past and present. And I don't think it's a sustainable project, because these students, these kids in class are paying for it. They're subsidizing it. And when they're $1.5 trillion in debt, I think there's a limit to what they'll be willing to subsidize.
And that may be one of the driving factors behind another trend that you noted in this piece, which is the growth of online education. And sometimes this is explicitly a substitute for higher ed, as in the case of some of the for-profit colleges. Other times it's just educational material that's put out there for people to consume as they see fit. And Victor, a lot of people in traditional university settings turn their nose up at this. They say you can't have the same experience sitting in front of a computer screen that you can in a classroom when you're interacting with a professor or other students. Are they right to be skeptical that this is a real substitute?
They are, in the sense that if you have a classical liberal arts college and you have faculty interacting with students, and they're residential students, and they're open-minded and they're engaging, challenging students, and the students are doing the same, it's a wonderful experience, and it can't be replicated in toto on the internet. But that's not what they're doing. They're about a faculty poll about 95% progressive, and they're intolerant, and they don't want people visiting campuses that disagree with them, because they don't believe in education, they believe in indoctrination. And so they've sort of said, well, what was a traditional give and take liberal arts policy doesn't exist anymore. There's safe spaces, there's segregated dorms by race, there's trigger warnings. So the modern university engages in racial segregation, even apartheid. It has censorship is fine. If you and I were to go to Stanford, we're all affiliated with, and we walked across the campus with a big sign and said, "Stop abortion now," or "Global warming is a hoax," people would shout you down. I don't think you'd make it across the campus. So it's not a free speech, lively environment anymore. I'm painting broad strokes, but because it's not, we've ceded to these private internet or online or for-profit technical schools a lot of territory. They're saying, if you want to learn electricity or you want to learn engineering, just come to us. We don't have liberal arts. We don't have any of that stuff. But you know what? The people who do corrupted it anyway, so you're not going to lose much. And that's the argument they're making. And then on research, when you got 7 billion people on the planet, that's a pretty good pool of auditors. So I can give you one example. When I was in my 30s, I was considered one of the top 2 or 3 people in ancient Greek warfare. And it was a meticulous science, and we would send refereed journal to article or university press books. They would be refereed, adjudicated, and accepted. It could take years, and it was very expensive. You got time off. And then the internet came along. And I noticed something, that while I would write an article, how much armor weighed, what was the spear for, what was the Battle of Marathon, what were changes of the Battle of Leuctra, these guys would get on the internet and they would have these ancient war blogs. And a lot of it was crazy, but there were so many of them, and they had bypassed the old boy network of quote unquote, blind refereeing, that eventually this stuff was better than what PhDs and universities were doing. At least some of it was. And then you ask yourself, well, how could that be? They're not the Martin and Millie Anderson Senior Fellow at Hoover. They're not a professor of classics at Harvard. They're not a Guggenheim Fellow. They're not a Yale sabbatical recipient. They're just people out there that like it, and they're putting it up there for discussion. And so the university just looks down at that. Very odd, because progressives are not supposed to be hierarchical at all and snobbish, but they are. So the internet and online things have really caught the university, blindsided the university, which is further ironic because the university's always prided itself of being on the cutting edge of social change and technology.
The final problem that you point to in higher education in the piece is an idea that's held as sacrosanct on university campuses, and that's tenure. So how sweeping is your indictment here? Are you in favor of reforming tenure, or would you get rid of it altogether?
No, I would reform it. So what I would say to faculty is the problem with tenure is that we treat people terribly for 6 years, and they try to be productive and work hard, and their peers judge them. And then once they have tenure, they're home free. We have something called post-tenure review that's a joke. And I mean that seriously. We had a child molester and an attempted murderer who we could not fire at Cal State Fresno, because he was tenured. And so what I'm suggesting is we could have 5-year contracts, and then the applicant goes before a faculty board and says, in the next 5 years, I will have teaching evaluations. It'll be here. I will have this many articles. I will be on this committees. This is what I'll do with a curriculum. And they can hash it out, and then they'll make a contract. And the people who are on the other end, they themselves will be subject to that, even though they've been there 20 years. They will have a contract. It'll be for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, it won't be an emotional, I lost my tenure, I was not given tenure, or I can do anything now that I have tenure. It'll just simply, did you meet these criteria? And if you didn't, see you later. That's something that the universities really fear, because it would really break up that logjam. You'd have all kinds of people coming in and out. And you would see that if somebody's 60, I'm 65, and if I decide that, I wrote a good book, I think, at 58, but I'm not going to write anything at 64 or 65 because I can't be fired, but I could be fired under this new system, then I might be more productive. And then the other thing with an exit exam, that every student who got a baccalaureate degree would have to pass a national exit exam. That second measure would really shake up the faculty, because they really couldn't afford to teach the stuff they do because it's of not much value. And then finally, if you told a graduate who wanted to go into teaching, and that's a huge percentage of college students today, that you don't really need to go get a credential that extra year in the Department of Education. Just get an MA in engineering or biology or English or history, and that'll be a far more enriching experience. And forget about the indoctrination. Just become a better scholar, be more knowledgeable, and have an MA, and we can substitute that, if you wish, for a teaching credential. Then all of a sudden we'd have teachers that were far better educated, but more importantly, they themselves wouldn't be indoctrinated to the same degree as those who come out of the education school. I think those three reforms of getting away with tenure and replacing it with periodic contracts, and having an exit exam, and allowing students not to have to go to the Department of Education for a credential. And it's very ironic, because professors get PhDs, and they're told as soon as they get their PhD, they just throw you into a class when you get hired at a university. But yet we're told that can't happen because you're not certified, you're not taught how to teach. And yet professors seem to do it pretty well. So why can't high school teachers do it the same?
So the final question that I'll put to you, Victor, you say early in this piece, the liberal arts and social sciences have long ago mostly lost their reputations. go online to Amazon or to the local Barnes & Noble bookstore, and the books on literature, art, and history are often not the products of university professors and presses. You are there noting the decline of a species that used to be called, somewhat self-servingly, public intellectuals, which is to say people like you who had advanced degrees and taught at a university but had a talent and a desire to educate the general public, to write and speak for popular audiences beyond their students. So what would you say to a college sophomore, say, who looks at your career and thinks, well, that's the kind of guy I want to be? Are the days in which the academy is the road to that kind of career over?
No, I don't think so. I think I learned a lot, even in a narrow PhD program in Greek philology. I learned how to cite evidence. I learned how to compare contrasting sources. In my narrow field, Herodotus said one thing and Polybius said another thing and Xenophon said another thing, and they were all in conflict. There were methodologies I could use to judge one as more valuable than the other. And that's kind of a science. The problem with it is that could be mastered in 4 years, and then you go out to use those tools to do stuff. But the problem is that you're also taught getting more narrower and narrower and narrower, and then fewer people can challenge you. So when I started, I was a Greek military historian. Then they said, no, you're a 5th century Greek military historian. No, you're going to specialize in the Theban army. No, you're going to specialize in the phalanx. And so I got to the point where I could say I was the world's expert in a particular aspect of Theban warfare between, 420 and 370 BC. But nobody had any interest in that. And it was absolutely a waste of time as far as students in Aristotle's classes or Plato's or Cicero or Petronius. So this over-specialization has really killed the idea of public intellectuals. And it's too bad, because the old way of giving people master's degrees or PhDs and then turning them loose was a good training. It was sort of a boot camp. And now, because they're so specialized in such indoctrination, I think that's why we don't have public intellectuals. We have people who are glib and they're autodidactic, which is fine, except an autodidact doesn't have a mentor or doesn't have a regimen that can guide him and tell him what's a waste of time and what's not. So we have sort of these scholastic mandarins that nobody listens to in the university. And then we have this whole sea of I don't know what we call them, but they're mostly autodidactic. And they've been self-taught and they're very bright. But the old idea that you had people that were trained and then they went out in the real world and built on that training as broadly as they can, there's very few of them anymore.
All right. You've been listening to the Classicist podcast with Victor Davis Hanson. Remember, you can read Victor's work at Defining Ideas at hoover.org, as well as at victorhanson.com. And if you enjoy the Classicist, please rate the show on iTunes. For Victor Davis Hanson, I'm Troy Senig. Thanks for listening.
This podcast has been a production of the Hoover Institution. For more information about our work, please visit hoover.org.